My name is Officer Darius Castellano, NYPD Emergency Service Unit. 3 days ago, I responded to what dispatch called a mass casualty incident at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. What I found wasn't terrorism or a gas leak. It was patient zero of the zombie outbreak that consumed New York City in 72 hours. I watched my partner turn, saw the military fail, and learned these things aren't mindless. They're evolving, coordinating, and hunting us with intelligence that grows every hour. I'm one of the few who made it out of Manhattan alive, and I need to tell you what's coming because they're not done with us yet. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Officer Darius Castellano, NYPD Emergency Service Unit, Shield number 4789. If you're listening to this broadcast, you're still breathing, which puts you in a very small percentage of the human population right now. I've been a cop for 12 years, 6 of those with the Emergency Service Unit. We handle the calls other officers can't. Hostage situations, building collapses, water rescues, armed barricades. I thought I'd seen every kind of violence this city could throw at me. I was wrong. 3 days ago, on October 15th, 2024, I woke up in my studio apartment in Bay Ridge thinking it would be another routine Tuesday. My alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, same as always. Coffee, shower, check the weather, grab my gear. The ESU van picked me up at 6:15 sharp. My partner that day was Officer Miguel Martinez, 24 years old, barely 2 years out of the academy. Good kid, eager to prove himself, always asking questions about tactics and procedure. He had this habit of checking his phone constantly, texting his girlfriend Maria about their weekend plans. The morning started normal. We responded to a domestic dispute in Sunset Park, nothing major. The husband was drunk, throwing furniture around, but he came quietly once he saw our tactical gear. Then we had a traffic stop on the Gowanus Expressway, some idiot doing 90 in a 35 zone. Standard stuff. But around 10 in the morning, the radio chatter started getting strange. Dispatch kept using codes I'd never heard in 12 years on the force. Code Yellow 7, Code Red 14. Martinez kept asking me what they meant, and I had to tell him I didn't know. That bothered me more than I let on. ESU gets briefed on every emergency protocol the department uses. We're supposed to know every code, every procedure, every contingency plan. When dispatch starts speaking in riddles, something's very wrong. By 11 o'clock, we were getting reports of multiple ambulances responding to hospitals across Brooklyn. Not just 1 or 2, but every available unit in the borough. Kings County, Brooklyn Methodist, Maimonides, New York Eye and Ear. All of them reporting what dispatch called mass casualty incidents with unknown biological hazards. That phrase kept repeating over the radio. Unknown biological hazard. In my experience, unknown meant dangerous and biological meant contagious. Lieutenant Rodriguez called us back to the precinct for what he termed an emergency briefing. Rodriguez is a 20-year veteran, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining NYPD. Nothing rattles that man. I've seen him talk down armed suspects, coordinate responses to building collapses, handle situations that would make most people freeze up. But when we walked into that briefing room, his hands were shaking. He kept checking his phone like he was waiting for bad news. Every few minutes it would buzz and his face would get a little paler. The other ESU officers noticed too. Thompson, our senior officer with 18 years on the force, asked Rodriguez if everything was all right at home. Rodriguez just said his wife worked at Brooklyn Methodist and hadn't returned his calls since 9 that morning. The briefing was unlike anything I'd experienced. Rodriguez explained that multiple hospitals across the city were reporting incidents involving patients attacking medical staff. Not just verbal confrontations or medication-induced aggression, but physical attacks resulting in severe injuries. Bite wounds, specifically. He said the words carefully like he was reading from a script he didn't quite believe. Martinez raised his hand and asked if we were dealing with some kind of drug-related psychosis. Good question. We'd seen PCP make people violent and unpredictable, bath salts causing cannibalistic behavior. Rodriguez shook his head. He said the toxicology reports were coming back clean. Whatever was causing this wasn't chemical. At 2:30 that afternoon, dispatch gave us our assignment. Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, Park Slope. Mass casualty incident with unknown biological hazard. All ESU teams were being deployed to secure the perimeter while emergency medical services established a treatment area. Rodriguez divided us into pairs. Martinez and I were assigned to the east entrance. Thompson and Officer Williams took the main entrance. Officers Park and Chen covered the emergency department. Loading dock. The van ride to Park Slope was quiet. Martinez kept fidgeting with his radio, trying to get clearer information about what we were walking into. All we knew was that Brooklyn Methodist had stopped taking emergency calls 2 hours earlier. The last communication from hospital administration was a request for immediate police and fire department response. Then nothing. When we turned onto 6th Street, I knew we weren't dealing with a standard medical emergency. There were 12 ambulances lined up on the street, 12 for one hospital. FDNY had cordoned off the entire block with yellow tape, but here's what made my skin crawl. Most of the paramedics and EMTs were just standing around, not rushing in with stretchers and medical equipment like they usually do, but standing in groups, talking in hushed voices, looking scared. I've worked with these people for years. New York City paramedics are tough. They'll run into burning buildings, work on gunshot victims while bullets are still flying, perform CPR in the middle of gang territory. They don't scare easily. But these guys looked terrified. Fire Captain Williams, a guy I'd known since my rookie days, walked over to our van. His face was grim. He said they'd established a perimeter but hadn't been able to make contact with anyone inside the hospital for over an hour. The last nurse to come out did so through a third-floor window, using bed sheets tied together. She was in shock, kept talking about patients eating people. Williams said they'd sedated her and transported her to Kings County. The automatic doors at the east entrance had been shattered from the inside. Not broken by impact from outside, but exploded outward like something had thrown itself against them repeatedly. Glass fragments were scattered across the sidewalk in a pattern that suggested multiple impacts. Blood smears painted the door frame at about shoulder height, and I remember thinking someone had tried very hard to get out of that place. Martinez asked if we should wait for backup. Standard protocol for unknown biological hazards called for hazmat teams and CDC consultation, but dispatch was insisting we secure the building immediately. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, tense and urgent. He said federal authorities were en route, but we needed to establish control of the situation before their arrival. The lobby hit us like a physical blow. The smell was the first thing. It wasn't just blood or antiseptic or the usual hospital odors. It was something organic and rotten, like meat that had been left in the sun for days. Sweet and nauseating and wrong in a way that made your brain immediately want to identify an exit route. The reception desk was overturned, computer monitors sparking on the tile floor. Patient files were scattered everywhere like confetti, mixing with broken glass and puddles of something dark and sticky. Wheelchairs were tipped over, IV stands bent at impossible angles. But the strangest thing was the silence. Hospitals are never quiet. There's always beeping machines, conversations, footsteps, the general hum of medical equipment. This place was dead quiet except for the sparking monitors and our own breathing. I tried my radio. Static. Cell phone showed no signal, which was unusual for Manhattan. The towers must have been jammed or damaged. We were essentially cut off from backup. Martinez looked at me with wide eyes, and I could tell he was fighting the urge to turn around and walk out. Truth is, so was I. The emergency ward's double. Doors had been barricaded with gurneys and chairs, but something had broken through from the other side. The metal doors hung twisted on their hinges like something incredibly strong had just ripped them apart. Dark handprints covered every surface at shoulder height. Dozens of them, like a crowd of people, had clawed their way through. Inside the emergency ward, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across overturned medical equipment. Every examination room stood open, curtains torn down, medical supplies scattered across the floor. Room 3's door was wide open, and I could see into the patient bay. Empty IV bags hung like deflated balloons, and a heart monitor beeped steadily at a flat line. That's when we heard the wet tearing sounds coming from the corner of room 3. She had been a nurse, Her scrubs were still light blue under all the blood, though the name tag was too covered in dark stains to read. She was crouched over something in the corner, her back to us, making those horrible wet sounds like someone tearing raw chicken apart with their bare hands. Her hair had fallen out in patches, leaving pale scalp visible underneath. Her skin looked gray under the harsh fluorescent lighting, like she'd been dead for hours. I called out to her, hand moving instinctively to my service weapon, asked if she was injured, identified myself as NYPD. Standard procedure for dealing with someone in medical distress. When she turned around, every piece of training I'd received in 12 years on the force became useless. Her eyes were completely white, like cataracts, but they tracked our movement with predatory focus. Her mouth hung open, jaw unhinged like a snake preparing to strike. Black fluid dripped from her lips onto her scrubs in steady drops. And in her hands, she clutched what remained of a doctor's arm, still wearing a surgical glove and a watch that was somehow still ticking. Martinez threw up right there in the doorway. The sound of his breakfast hitting the floor echoed through the empty emergency ward. The thing that had been a nurse turned its attention to us completely. It dropped, the arm with a wet thud that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, however long that might be. Then it rose to its feet in one fluid motion that no human spine should have been able to make. Too fast, too smooth, like it was being pulled up by invisible strings. And then it screamed. Not a human scream of pain or fear or rage, but something between a roar and the sound of tearing metal. The noise echoed through the empty hospital corridors, bouncing off walls and creating a horrible reverberating effect that seemed to go on forever. Within seconds, we heard answering calls from deeper in the building. Lots of them. Coming from different floors, different wings, all responding to that first terrible sound like wolves howling to signal a hunt. I whispered to Martinez to run, then said it louder as more sounds joined the chorus. We sprinted back through the lobby as the noises grew behind us. Not just footsteps, but something wrong about the rhythm. Like they were stumbling but never falling, moving with purpose but not coordination. I risked a glance back and saw at least 6 figures pouring out of the emergency ward. Former patients in hospital gowns, their skin that same gray color. A security guard still wearing his badge and radio, though his uniform was torn and stained. What might have been a janitor, dragging something behind him that looked like a mop bucket, but was making terrible scraping sounds against the floor. All of them had those same white tracking eyes. All of them moved with that unnatural fluid motion. And all of them were focused entirely on us. We burst through the shattered entrance doors and into the afternoon sunlight. Martinez was already on his radio, screaming for backup, for air support, for anyone to respond. But all we got was static mixed with garbled transmissions that might have been other officers in similar situations. I looked back at the hospital's windows and saw faces pressed against the glass on every floor. Dozens of them, all with that same gray skin and those horrible, hungry white eyes. Some were wearing scrubs, others were in patient gowns, a few in street clothes. But they all had the same expression of focused predatory intent. That was 4:23 in the afternoon on October 15th, 2024. The moment I realized that everything I thought I knew about emergency response, about protecting people, about maintaining order in chaos was about to become completely irrelevant. By 6 o'clock that evening, reports were coming in from hospitals across all 5 boroughs. The same pattern. Medical staff and patients attacking anyone they could reach, then those victims rising minutes later to join the attack. Emergency services were being overwhelmed not by the number of incidents but by their nature. How do you treat someone who's been bitten when the person who bit them is still trying to attack you? Martinez and I spent the rest of the day moving from one emergency call to another, each worse than the last. A nursing home in Bensonhurst where the entire staff had turned on the residents. An urgent care clinic in Sheepshead Bay, where a patient had bitten a doctor, who then bit a nurse, who then attacked a family in the waiting room. The infection was spreading through direct contact, and it was spreading fast. By 8 o'clock, we started noticing something that made the situation infinitely worse. The infected weren't just randomly violent. They were displaying behavior that suggested coordination. Groups of them would surround buildings, trying different entrances until they found a way in. Others would create noise to attract potential victims, then attack when people came to investigate. At 9:30 that night, I watched Mrs. Chen from the corner grocery store get pulled down by 3 infected outside her own shop. She'd been trying to help what she thought was an injured customer. Within 30 minutes, she was standing up again, but her eyes had gone white and she was attacking her own grandson who'd come looking for her. That's when I had to make the first kill. Mrs. Chen had been like a grandmother to half the neighborhood. I'd bought coffee from her store every morning for 6 years. She knew my order by heart, always, asked about my family, worried when I worked late shifts. Putting a bullet in her head while her grandson screamed was the hardest thing I'd ever done as a police officer. But it wasn't the last. By 10 o'clock, we were getting reports that the infection had reached Manhattan. The bridges were clogged, with people trying to flee Brooklyn, but also with people trying to get in to find loved ones. The resulting chaos created perfect conditions for the infection to spread. One infected person in a crowd of thousands, and within hours you had thousands of infected. At 11:15, dispatch went silent. The last transmission was a garbled message about federal intervention and martial law protocols. Then nothing but static on all frequencies. We were on our own. Martinez and I found ourselves part of a group of maybe 20 survivors holed up in PS 321, the elementary school on 7th Avenue. Teachers, parents who'd come to pick up their kids, a few other first responders. We barricaded the doors and windows, tried to figure out our next move. That's when we started hearing the stories from people who'd escaped other parts of the city. The infection wasn't limited to hospitals anymore. It was spreading through apartment buildings, office complexes, subway stations. Anywhere people gathered in large numbers was becoming a death trap. But the most disturbing reports came from survivors who'd been watching the infected for hours. They were learning, adapting their behavior based on what worked and what didn't. Using tools to break down barriers, setting what could only be described as ambushes for fleeing humans. By midnight on October 15th, half of Brooklyn had gone dark. Power grids were failing as infected overran electrical substations. Cell towers were going down one by one, cutting off communication between survivor groups. The city was fragmenting into isolated pockets of people trying to stay alive until morning. But the really terrifying part was what we could see from the school's third-floor windows. The infected weren't just wandering around randomly anymore. They were moving in groups following what looked like patrol routes through the neighborhood. Some carried improvised weapons. Others seemed to be checking doors and windows systematically, looking for ways into buildings where survivors might be hiding. These weren't mindless zombies from the movies. They were retaining enough intelligence to hunt us effectively, but they'd lost whatever made them human. The combination of predatory intelligence and complete lack of empathy or self-preservation made them more dangerous than any criminal I'd ever faced. As we sat in that dark classroom, listening to inhuman sounds echoing through the empty streets, Martinez asked me what we were supposed to do. Standard police procedure didn't cover this situation. Our training focused on de-escalation, negotiation, using minimum necessary force. None of that applied when you were facing something that had no interest in communication and couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated. I told him we were going to survive. We were going to protect the civilians in our group, find other survivors, and figure out how to get out of the city. But even as I said it, I could see the infection spreading through the streetlights below us like a slow-moving wave of death and chaos. The thing about emergencies is they follow patterns. House fires spread predictably. Car accidents happen, in certain ways under specific conditions. Even terrorist attacks usually have identifiable methods and goals. This didn't follow any pattern I recognized. It was organic, adaptive, and spreading faster than any response we could mount. At 2 in the morning on October 16th, we watched the lights go out in Manhattan, the entire skyline dark for the first time in living memory. Whatever was happening in Brooklyn had reached the heart of New York City, and it was winning. The morning of October 16th started with screaming, not human screaming, but that same metallic shriek we'd heard from the infected nurse at Brooklyn Methodist. It was coming from multiple directions now, echoing through the empty streets like some kind of twisted morning alarm. Martinez and I had spent the night taking turns on watch duty at PS 321, And what we saw through those classroom windows changed everything I thought I understood about this outbreak. The infected were moving differently. During the first 12 hours, they'd been chaotic, individual hunters following scent trails or sounds. But overnight, something had shifted. They were forming groups, moving in coordinated patterns through the neighborhood. Some carried makeshift weapons they'd picked up from broken storefronts. Others seemed to be checking doors and windows systematically like they were conducting searches. Mrs. Rodriguez, one of the teachers we'd sheltered with, had been watching them through the night. She told me she'd counted at least 40 infected passing by the school in organized groups of 5 or 6. Each group took a different route, but they were all moving in the same general direction. Toward the bridges, toward Manhattan. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with a medical crisis anymore. This was starting to look like an invasion, and the infected were the army. At 7 in the morning, we got our first communication from outside Brooklyn, a scratchy radio transmission from someone claiming to be FDNY Captain Morrison, operating out of a firehouse in Queens. He said they were seeing infected crossing the Queensboro Bridge in organized columns, not shambling or wandering, but marching, with purpose toward specific targets in Manhattan. Morrison's voice was shaking when he described what his men had observed. The infected were ignoring random civilians on the street, focusing instead on strategic locations, police stations, hospitals, communication centers. They were targeting the infrastructure that would allow organized resistance to form. Martinez asked me how that was possible. These things had been human beings less than 24 hours ago. How could they develop military tactics that fast? I didn't have an answer then, but I was starting to form a theory that scared me more than anything else we'd witnessed. By 8:30, we had to move. The infected had found PS 321, not by accident, but because they'd been systematically checking every building in a 6-block radius. We could hear them testing doors on the first floor, working their way up. The 20 survivors in our group included 7 adults and 13 children, ranging from 6 to 15 years old. Moving that many people quietly through infected territory seemed impossible, but staying put meant certain death. The plan was simple. We'd move in groups of 5, using the subway tunnels to avoid the infected patrols on the surface. The Atlantic Avenue station was only 3 blocks away, and from there we could take the R train toward Manhattan. The bridges were clearly compromised, but the tunnels might still be clear. Officer Thompson, who'd found us around midnight after his partner got separated, took point with the first group. He'd been dealing with infected attacks all night, and had learned some disturbing things about their behavior. They were attracted to loud noises and sudden movements, but they also seemed to recognize faces. Thompson had encountered the same, infected multiple times, and each time they'd reacted more quickly to his presence. The elementary school's back exit led into an alley that connected to 7th Avenue. We could see infected moving in the distance, but the immediate area seemed clear. Thompson's group made it to the street without incident. Martinez and I followed with the second group, including Mrs. Rodriguez and 4 of her students. That's when we discovered the infected had been setting traps. The moment we stepped onto 7th Avenue, infected emerged from doorways and side streets we'd thought were empty. Not running chaotically like they had the day before, but moving with calculated precision to cut off our escape routes. They'd been waiting for us to leave the building. Thompson's group was already 50 yards ahead, almost to the subway entrance. I shouted for them to keep moving, not to look back. Our group was surrounded, but maybe the others could still make it to safety. The infected that emerged from the barbershop doorway had been the owner, a man named Tony who'd cut hair in that same location for 30 years. He still wore his barber smock, but his skin had that gray pallor, and his eyes were completely white. In his hand, he carried a straight razor that gleamed in the morning sunlight. What happened next taught me the most important lesson about fighting these things. They retained muscle memory and professional skills. Tony moved like he'd been trained in close-quarters combat, using the razor with surgical precision. This wasn't random violence. This was skilled predation. Martinez managed to put Tony down with 2 shots to the head, but not before Tony had slashed one of the children, a girl named Emma, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The cut was deep, running from her shoulder to her elbow. Blood was flowing freely and Emma was crying for her mother. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately started applying pressure to the wound, but we all knew what a bite or scratch meant. Emma had maybe 30 minutes before the infection took hold. The question was whether we could get her medical attention before that happened, and whether medical attention would even matter at this point. We made it to the Atlantic Avenue station, but what we found there made our situation infinitely worse. The subway platform was packed with infected, not just a few individuals, but dozens of them, all standing perfectly still like they were waiting for something. Or someone. Thompson's group was pinned, down behind a newspaper stand, surrounded by infected who weren't attacking but weren't letting them move either. It was like they were being herded, controlled by some intelligence that was thinking several moves ahead. That's when I heard the first coordinated attack signals, a series of metallic shrieks coming from different parts of the station, each one answered by others in a pattern that suggested communication. The infected weren't just reacting to stimuli anymore, they were talking to each other. Emma was getting weaker, and the wound on her arm was starting to change color around the edges. Mrs. Rodriguez kept insisting we could save her, that there had to be medical facilities somewhere in the city that were still operational. But I'd seen this progression twice already. First with Mrs. Chen, then with a paramedic who'd been scratched while trying to treat victims at Brooklyn Methodist. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was neurological. Emma was still conscious, still able to speak, but her responses were becoming delayed and mechanical. She kept asking for her mother, but with less emotion each time. Like she was forgetting why that request was important. At 9:45, we had to make a choice that still haunts me. Emma's eyes were starting to cloud over and she was no longer responding to pain stimuli. Mrs. Rodriguez was begging me to find another solution, but Emma was becoming one of them and we had 12 other children to protect. Martinez volunteered to handle it. He said Emma reminded him of his little sister, and it should be someone who cared about her. I told him that was exactly why he shouldn't be the one, but he'd already made up his mind. Sometimes the hardest part of survival isn't staying alive. It's staying human while you do it. By 10:30, we'd managed to work our way through the subway tunnels to the Brooklyn Bridge station. The tunnels themselves were mostly clear, but we could hear infected moving through the parallel passages. They were definitely using the subway system for transportation, which meant nowhere underground was truly safe. The Brooklyn Bridge station platform gave us our first clear view of Manhattan, and what we saw there destroyed any hope we had of finding safety across the river. Smoke was rising from dozens of locations across the island. The infection hadn't just reached Manhattan, it had consumed it. Emergency broadcasts were still coming through on some radio frequencies, but the information was fragmentary and contradictory. Some stations were reporting that federal authorities had the situation under control. Others were advising civilians to shelter in place and avoid all contact with infected individuals. A few were broadcasting automated messages about evacuation, procedures that clearly weren't being followed. The most disturbing broadcast came from someone claiming to be a CDC epidemiologist working out of a mobile laboratory in New Jersey. She said the infection was spreading faster than any known pathogen, with a transmission rate that suggested airborne components in addition to direct contact. She also mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The infected were showing signs of coordinated behavior that indicated some form of collective intelligence. By noon, we'd decided to attempt crossing the Brooklyn Bridge on foot. The subway tunnels were becoming increasingly dangerous as more infected figured out how to use them for navigation. Our group had grown to 31 people, including refugees, from other parts of Brooklyn who'd found their way to the subway system. The walk across the Brooklyn Bridge became a nightmare that lasted 3 hours. The bridge was packed with abandoned vehicles and refugees trying to flee in both directions. Some were carrying everything they owned. Others had nothing but the clothes on their backs. Everyone was desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous even when they're not infected. Halfway across the bridge, we encountered our first roadblock. A group of infected had positioned themselves at the highest point of the span, creating a choke point that forced all the refugees into a narrow corridor. It was clearly deliberate. They were using the bridge's architecture to create a trap. What happened next showed me just how much the infected had evolved in less than 24 hours. Instead of attacking immediately, they waited until the maximum number of people were trapped in the killing zone. Then they struck with coordinated precision, working together to maximize casualties and minimize their own losses. Martinez and I were near the back of the refugee column when the attack began. We could see infected emerging from behind abandoned cars and climbing over the bridge railings from positions they'd obviously prepared in advance. The level of tactical planning involved was terrifying. In the chaos that followed, Martinez got separated from our group. I saw him trying to help a family with small children reach the Manhattan side of the bridge, but the crowd was pushing in all directions, and the infected were using the panic to their advantage. The last clear view I had of Martinez, he was being dragged backward by the surge of fleeing people, his hand reaching toward me as the crowd carried him away. I should have gone after him. Martinez was my partner, my responsibility. But I had Mrs. Rodriguez and 8 children depending on me to get them to safety, and the infected were closing in from both sides. Sometimes leadership means making choices that you'll regret for the rest of your life, however long that might be. We made it to Manhattan, but at a cost. Of the 31 people who'd started the crossing, only 16 reached the other side. The rest were either killed by the infected or separated in the chaos. Mrs. Rodriguez had managed to keep 6 of her students together, but she'd lost 7 others somewhere in that nightmare on the bridge. Lower Manhattan was a war zone. Military vehicles were moving through the streets, but they weren't conducting rescue operations. They were setting up barricades and establishing firing positions. Soldiers in full combat gear were treating civilians like potential threats, demanding identification and medical examinations before allowing anyone to pass through their checkpoints. At a checkpoint near City Hall, we encountered Major Reynolds, a career military officer who'd been dealing with the outbreak since the early morning hours. He explained that the infection had reached Manhattan around midnight, starting with infected who'd crossed the bridges from Brooklyn and Queens. By dawn, there were reports of infection clusters in all 5 boroughs. Major Reynolds kept checking his watch like he was waiting for something, and his men seemed unusually tense for trained soldiers. When I asked about evacuation procedures, for civilians, he said they were implementing containment protocols first, evacuation second. That phrase made me uncomfortable. In my experience, containment meant keeping something locked up, not letting it out. The military's assessment was that they were dealing with an unknown biological weapon, possibly terrorist in origin. They were treating the infected as enemy combatants rather than medical patients. That approach had led to some tactical successes, but it also meant they were fighting this thing with conventional military thinking. Reynolds showed us intelligence reports that painted a picture of coordinated attacks across multiple cities: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, D.C., all experiencing similar outbreaks within hours of each other. The timing suggested either a massive coordinated release or some kind of rapid transmission mechanism that medical science didn't yet understand. By 3 in the afternoon, the military had decided to implement what they called surgical strikes against large concentrations of infected, controlled demolitions and targeted airstrikes to eliminate infection clusters before they could spread further. It sounded reasonable in theory, but I had serious doubts about the execution. The first bombing run targeted an apartment complex in Lower Manhattan where infected had gathered in large numbers. The explosion was visible from our position near City Hall, a pillar of smoke and debris that rose into the afternoon sky. For a moment, it looked like the military approach might work. Then we started hearing the answering calls. The same metallic shrieks we'd been hearing all day, but now coming from dozens of locations across the city. The explosion hadn't just killed infected, it had called them. Every infected within miles was now moving toward the sound of the bombing, drawn by the noise like moths to a flame. Reynolds realized his mistake immediately. The bombing had created a beacon that was attracting infected from across the metropolitan area. Instead of eliminating the threat, they'd just concentrated it in one location, and that location was Manhattan, where millions of people were still trapped. By 4 o'clock, infected were pouring into Lower Manhattan from all directions. Not just the shambling, disorganized groups we'd seen in Brooklyn, but organized formations that moved with military precision. They were using the same tactics Reynolds had tried to use against them, concentrating their forces for maximum impact. The military checkpoint at City Hall was overrun in less than 30 minutes. Professional soldiers with advanced weapons and tactical training were overwhelmed by infected who showed no fear of death and felt no pain from their wounds. The only way to stop them was complete destruction of the brain, and that required precision shooting under extreme pressure. Mrs. Rodriguez and I managed to escape with 4 children into the subway tunnels beneath City Hall. The underground passages seemed like our best chance for survival, but we quickly discovered that the infected were down there too. They were using the tunnel system like a highway, moving between different parts of the city without having to deal with military forces on the surface. What we found in those tunnels changed my understanding of what we were fighting. The infected weren't just using the subway for transportation, they were modifying it. Barricades made from subway debris, positioned to channel movement in specific directions. Traps designed to catch fleeing humans. Evidence of planning and construction that required sustained effort over many hours. Most disturbing were the areas that looked like gathering points. Large open spaces where dozens of infected had congregated, not for feeding, but for what could only be described as meetings. They were communicating with each other, sharing information, coordinating their activities across the entire city. By 6 in the evening, we could hear military aircraft overhead conducting bombing runs across Manhattan. The explosions were constant, shaking dust from the tunnel ceilings and making it difficult to navigate in the darkness. But instead of reducing the infected threat, the bombing seemed to be making it worse. Each explosion drew more infected to the targeted area. They were adapting to the military's tactics faster than the military could adapt to theirs. What's worse, the bombing was destroying the infrastructure the military needed to maintain control. Communication systems, power grids, transportation, networks. The cure was becoming worse than the disease. Around 8 o'clock, we encountered a group of survivors who'd been hiding in the subway tunnels since the early morning hours. They'd witnessed the infection spreading through Manhattan in real time, and their reports were terrifying. The infected weren't just randomly attacking people anymore. They were specifically targeting individuals with useful skills. Medical, personnel, engineers, police officers, military veterans. Anyone who might be able to organize effective resistance was being hunted down first. The infected seemed to understand that eliminating leadership would cripple human response efforts. They were fighting a war, and they were winning. One survivor, a nurse named Patricia, had escaped from Mount Sinai Hospital after watching infected systematically eliminate the entire medical staff. She said they'd moved through the hospital floor by floor, ignoring patients but specifically targeting doctors, nurses, and administrators, like they had a list of priority targets. By 10 o'clock, we were hearing reports that the infection had spread beyond New York City. Philadelphia was reporting similar outbreaks. Boston was going dark. The federal government was implementing martial law protocols, but their response was fragmented and ineffective. They were fighting the last war, not the war that was actually happening. The most chilling report came from a ham radio operator in New Jersey who claimed to have intercepted military communications. According to him, federal authorities were discussing the possibility of nuclear strikes against major metropolitan areas, not as a last resort, but as a preferred option to prevent further spread of the infection. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me what that meant for the children we were trying to protect. I told her it meant we had to get out of New York City as fast as possible. The bridges were compromised, the tunnels were becoming death traps, and the military was preparing to turn Manhattan into a crater. At 11:30, we made contact with a group of NYPD officers who'd established a temporary command post in an abandoned subway station near Union Square. They'd been coordinating rescue efforts for civilian survivors, but their resources were limited and their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sergeant Murphy, a 25-year veteran, explained that the department had lost contact with most precincts by mid-afternoon. The infected were specifically targeting police facilities, using tactics that suggested inside knowledge of department procedures and protocols. They knew where the armories were located, which stations had the best communication equipment, how patrol routes were organized. Murphy also confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Some of the infected retained enough of their original personalities to use skills and knowledge from their human lives. A infected who'd been a locksmith could still pick locks. A infected who'd been a soldier still understood military tactics. The infection wasn't destroying their abilities. It was redirecting them toward predatory purposes. By midnight on October 16th, 36 hours after the first incident at Brooklyn, Methodist Hospital, Manhattan was effectively under siege. The military had established a perimeter around the island, but they weren't trying to rescue civilians anymore. They were trying to contain the infection, even if that meant sacrificing everyone still trapped inside the city. The bombing runs continued throughout the night, but they were no longer surgical strikes. They were carpet bombing designed to destroy everything in targeted areas regardless of whether there were survivors present. The military had decided that acceptable losses included pretty much everyone who hadn't already been evacuated. From our position in the subway tunnels, we could feel the explosions getting closer. Each bombing run was followed by periods of eerie silence, then the sound of infected moving through the tunnels toward the blast sites. They were still being drawn to the noise, but now they were moving in organized groups that suggested central coordination. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me if I thought we were going to survive the night. I told her we were going to try, but honestly, I wasn't sure anymore. The infected were evolving faster than we could adapt. The military was treating us as acceptable casualties. And somewhere in those dark tunnels, Martinez was either dead or worse. The rules I'd learned in 12 years of police work didn't apply to this situation. You can't negotiate with something that doesn't want anything you can give. You can't intimidate something that doesn't fear death. You can't reason with something that's lost the capacity for human empathy, but retained the intelligence to hunt you effectively. As we settled in for what might be our last night alive, I could hear the infected moving through the tunnels around us. Not randomly, but with purpose. They were positioning themselves for something big, and I had the terrible feeling that whatever they were planning would make the last 36 hours look like a practice run. Dawn on October 17th brought the sound of helicopters. Not the news choppers or police aviation units we were used to seeing over Manhattan, but military aircraft flying in formation patterns that suggested a major operation was underway. From our position in the subway tunnels beneath Union Square, we could hear the distinctive whump of heavy transport helicopters mixed with the higher pitch of attack aircraft. Sergeant Murphy had managed to establish radio contact with what remained of Federal Command structure around 4 in the morning. The news wasn't good. Washington was reporting similar outbreaks in 17 major metropolitan areas across the United States. The infection had jumped continental boundaries with confirmed cases in London, Paris, and Tokyo. This wasn't just a New York problem anymore. This was global. But the military response was finally getting organized. Major Reynolds, who'd survived the disaster at City Hall by retreating to a fortified position near the Brooklyn Bridge, was coordinating with federal authorities to establish what they called containment and elimination protocols. The plan was to divide Manhattan into sectors, clear each sector systematically, and establish safe zones for civilian evacuation. It sounded professional and organized, the kind of military efficiency that had won wars and resolved international crises. The problem was that the infected weren't following the rules of conventional warfare. They were adapting to military tactics faster than the military could implement them. Mrs. Rodriguez had spent the night watching the 4 children we'd managed to keep together. Tommy, age 9, whose parents had been separated from us during the bridge crossing. Lisa and Maria, twin sisters who were 12 and had been clinging to each other since we found them in the subway tunnels. And David, 15 years old, who'd appointed himself the protector of the younger children, despite being barely more than a child himself. These kids had seen things that would traumatize combat veterans. They'd watched their teachers get torn apart by people they'd known and trusted. They'd had to run for their lives through streets filled with predators that used to be their neighbors. But they were surviving, adapting, learning the new rules faster than most adults. David had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect infected presence. He could tell when they were nearby, even when we couldn't see or hear them. When I asked him how he knew, he said they smelled different. Not just the rotting meat odor we'd all noticed, but something else. Something chemical and wrong that your brain recognized even when your conscious mind couldn't identify it. Around 7 in the morning, we heard the first coordinated military assault beginning on the surface. Automatic weapons fire, explosions, radio chatter echoing down through ventilation shafts and subway grates. The federal forces were implementing their sector-by-sector clearing operation, starting with Lower Manhattan and working their way north. For the first hour, it sounded like the plan was working. Sustained gunfire followed by periods of relative quiet, then movement to the next area. Professional, methodical, effective. Major Reynolds was reporting successful clearance of targeted zones and establishment of secure perimeters. Then the explosions started getting bigger. The military had discovered what we'd learned the hard way during the first 2 days. The infected were using the noise of combat to coordinate their movements. Each gunfight drew more infected to the area, concentrating them in ways that required increasingly heavy firepower to eliminate. What had started as precision operations was escalating into area bombing. But here's what made the situation infinitely worse. The bombing wasn't just attracting infected from within Manhattan, it was calling them from across the entire metropolitan area. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, New Jersey. Millions of infected were converging on Manhattan in response to the military operations. By 9 o'clock, Major Reynolds was requesting immediate reinforcement and air support. His forces were being overwhelmed not by the infected they were trying to eliminate, but by the infected who were responding to the elimination efforts. The cure was making the disease exponentially worse. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me if we should try to reach the military lines and identify ourselves as survivors. Standard procedure would be to make contact with friendly forces and request evacuation to a safe area. But something about the military radio chatter was making me nervous. They kept using phrases like acceptable losses and collateral damage when discussing civilian casualties. Around 10:30, we got our answer about military intentions. A helicopter announcement broadcast throughout the subway system ordered all civilians to report to designated evacuation points for immediate processing and transportation. The tone was official and reassuring, but the word processing bothered me. In my experience, people get evacuated. Objects get processed. Sergeant Murphy was suspicious too. He'd been monitoring military communications all morning, and the language they were using suggested they were treating surviving civilians as potential infection vectors rather than rescue priorities. There was talk of quarantine facilities, medical screening, and indefinite detention for anyone who'd been exposed to infected individuals. Given that exposure was pretty much unavoidable if you'd survived this long in Manhattan, indefinite detention seemed to apply to everyone who wasn't already dead. We decided to avoid the military evacuation points and try to reach the evacuation zone they'd established in Queens. The plan was to use the subway tunnels to move beneath the infected concentrations on the surface, then emerge near the Queensboro Bridge and attempt to cross during daylight hours when visibility was better. The journey through the tunnel system became an education in how much the infected had evolved over the past 48 hours. They weren't just using the tunnels for transportation anymore. They were fortifying them. Barricades constructed from subway debris, positioned to create choke points and killing zones, traps designed to channel human movement into predetermined areas. Most disturbing were the modifications they'd made to the infrastructure itself. Subway cars had been repositioned to block certain passages while leaving others open. Platform areas had been converted into what could only be described as staging areas, with evidence of large groups gathering and organizing before moving to specific objectives. The level of coordination required for these modifications suggested a central intelligence directing their activities. Individual infected might retain skills from their human lives, but this kind of systematic engineering required planning and communication on a scale that shouldn't have been possible for beings that had been human less than 3 days ago. Around noon, we encountered our first evidence of what the infected were doing with the humans they captured alive. In an abandoned subway car near the 59th Street station, we found what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. Medical equipment salvaged from hospitals, arranged in patterns that suggested experimentation rather than treatment. The smell in that subway car was indescribable, not just death and decay, but something chemical and biological that made your eyes water and your throat close up. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately ordered the children to stay back while Sergeant Murphy and I investigated. What we found inside changed everything. I thought I understood about the infection. Human subjects, still alive but restrained, with various stages of infection progression deliberately induced and monitored. The infected weren't just mindlessly converting every human they encountered. They were studying us, learning how the infection worked, how to control it, how to optimize it for their purposes. Some of the subjects had been partially infected and then somehow stabilized in an intermediate state. They were conscious and aware, but their behavior was altered in ways that suggested external control. They responded to simple commands from infected handlers, but showed no initiative or independent thought. Sergeant Murphy called them drones, humans who'd been converted into controllable biological tools while retaining enough of their original capabilities to perform complex tasks. The infected weren't just eliminating human resistance, they were enslaving it. By 1 o'clock, the military bombing campaign had escalated to the point where entire city blocks were being leveled. We could feel the explosions through the bedrock beneath the subway tunnels, and dust was constantly falling from the tunnel ceilings. Major Reynolds was reporting successful elimination of infected concentrations, but he was also requesting authorization for increasingly destructive ordnance. The radio chatter we were intercepting painted a picture of military forces that were winning individual battles but losing the war. Each successful operation required more firepower and resulted in more collateral damage. The infected were learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics, finding new ways to exploit military procedures and equipment. Around 2:30, we heard something that made my blood run cold. A radio transmission from Major Reynolds, requesting permission to deploy tactical nuclear weapons against the largest infected concentration in Midtown Manhattan. He was arguing that conventional weapons were insufficient to eliminate the threat, and that nuclear strikes were the only way to prevent further spread of the infection. The request was denied, but the fact that it was even being considered told me everything I needed to know about how desperate the situation had become. The military was preparing to destroy Manhattan rather than allow the infection to spread beyond the island. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me what nuclear weapons would mean for the children we were trying to protect. I told her it meant we had to get off Manhattan immediately, regardless of the risks involved in crossing infected territory. The federal government was running out of conventional options, and when governments run out of options, they start considering previously unthinkable alternatives. Around 3 o'clock, we reached the tunnel system beneath the Queensboro Bridge. What we found there destroyed any remaining hope I had of reaching the military evacuation zone in Queens. The tunnels were packed with infected, but not in the chaotic, disorganized way we'd seen during the first 2 days. They were arranged in formation, rows and columns of infected standing at attention like soldiers in a parade ground, all facing the same direction, all completely motionless, all waiting for something. The sight of hundreds of infected standing in perfect military formation was more terrifying than anything we'd witnessed so far. But the worst part was what we could see at the front of the formation. Infected wearing military uniforms, some still carrying weapons, arranged in what was clearly a command structure. These weren't random victims who'd been converted during the fighting. These were military personnel who'd been specifically targeted, infected, and then organized into a hostile force. Sergeant Murphy recognized some of the uniforms, units that had been deployed to Manhattan as part of the containment operation, now standing in formation with white eyes and gray skin, ready to be deployed against their former comrades. The infected weren't just fighting the military. They were recruiting from it. David whispered that we needed to leave immediately. His infection detection ability was telling him that the entire formation was about to move, and we didn't want to be anywhere nearby when that happened. We backed away from the tunnel entrance and found an alternative route toward the surface. By 4 o'clock, we could hear the infected military formation moving through the tunnels beneath us. Hundreds of footsteps in perfect synchronization, like a marching band made of nightmares. They were deploying toward specific objectives with coordination that matched or exceeded anything the human military had demonstrated. The surface near the Queensboro Bridge was a war zone, military vehicles burning, barricades overrun, evidence of fierce fighting that had ended with infected victory. The evacuation zone in Queens was still operational, but the approaches to it were controlled by infected forces that were using captured military equipment and tactics. Major Reynolds was no longer responding to radio calls. His last transmission had been a request for immediate air support and medical evacuation for wounded personnel. After that, nothing but static on his frequency. Either his forces had been overrun or he'd been converted and was now part of the infected command structure. Around 5 o'clock, we found ourselves trapped in a subway station near Roosevelt Island. Infected were moving through the tunnels in both directions, conducting what appeared to be a coordinated sweep for remaining human survivors. We could hear them checking every side passage, every maintenance area, every possible hiding place. But they weren't just looking for us randomly. They were following a systematic search pattern that suggested they knew exactly how many humans were in the area and where we were likely to be hiding. Someone or something was directing their search with intelligence that bordered on omniscience. That's when I heard a voice I recognized calling my name from the tunnel entrance. Martinez, my partner, who'd been separated from us during the chaos on the Brooklyn Bridge more than 24 hours ago. He was standing at the far end of the platform, still wearing his NYPD uniform, looking exactly like he had when we'd been separated. Except for his eyes. They were completely white. Martinez called out to me again, using my first name and referencing shared experiences from our time as partners. He knew details that only the real Martinez would know. Our conversations about his girlfriend Maria, his concerns about making detective, his habit of checking his phone constantly for text messages. But the voice was wrong, too calm, too controlled, lacking the emotional inflection that made Martinez human. It was like listening to a computer program that had access to Martinez's memories, but didn't understand what they meant. Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed my arm and whispered that we needed to run. She could see what I was struggling to accept. The thing, wearing Martinez's face, wasn't my partner anymore. It was something else using his appearance and memories to try to lure us into a trap. The infected Martinez continued talking, describing our shared experiences with perfect accuracy but complete emotional detachment. He mentioned the morning of October 15th, the call to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, the infected nurse we'd encountered in the emergency ward. But he talked about it like he was reading from a report, not recalling a traumatic experience. Then he said something that made my decision easy. He told me that the infection was inevitable, that resistance was pointless, and that cooperation would result in better treatment for the children we were protecting. The real Martinez would never have suggested using children as bargaining chips, no matter how desperate the situation became. We ran, through maintenance tunnels and emergency exits, up service ladders and through ventilation shafts, anywhere that would get us away from the thing that had been my partner. Behind us, I could hear Martinez calling my name with increasing urgency, his voice losing the pretense of humanity and becoming something mechanical and hungry. By 6 o'clock, we'd managed to reach the surface near Carl Schurz Park on the Upper East Side. The area was relatively quiet, with most of the military action concentrated in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. But the quiet was deceptive. We could see infected moving through the park in small groups, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance operations. The federal evacuation zone in Queens was still broadcasting emergency instructions, but the content had changed. Instead of promising rescue and safety, they were now advising survivors to remain in place and await collection by authorized personnel. The change in language suggested that the military situation had deteriorated to the point where organized evacuation was no longer possible. Around 7:30, we heard the sound that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. A coordinated roar coming from thousands of infected throats simultaneously, echoing across Manhattan from multiple locations. It wasn't random noise. It was communication on a scale that suggested the entire infected population of the city was acting as a single organism. The sound was answered by similar roars from Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey. Infected populations across the metropolitan area were coordinating their activities in real time, sharing information and adjusting their tactics based on changing circumstances. The individual infected we'd been fighting were just components of a larger intelligence. that was learning and adapting faster than human military forces could respond. Sergeant Murphy checked his radio and confirmed what we'd all suspected. Military communications had gone silent across all frequencies. Either the federal forces had been completely eliminated, or they'd been converted and were now part of the infected command structure. Either way, organized human resistance in the New York metropolitan area had effectively ceased to exist. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me what that meant for our chances of survival. I told her it meant we were on our own, that the government couldn't help us anymore, and that our only hope was to get as far away from populated areas as possible before the infected finished consolidating their control over the region. By 9 o'clock, we could see fires burning across Manhattan from our position in the park. Not random fires caused by combat damage, but controlled burns that appeared to be systematically destroying specific types of infrastructure. Communication centers, transportation hubs, power generation facilities. The infected were methodically eliminating humanity's ability to organize large-scale resistance. The most disturbing sight was the Queensboro Bridge. Infected were crossing from Manhattan to Queens in organized columns, moving with military precision toward the federal evacuation zone. They weren't just eliminating human resistance within Manhattan. They were expanding their operations to eliminate it everywhere within striking distance. Around 10:30, we intercepted a weak radio signal from someone claiming to be broadcasting from a bunker beneath the Federal Reserve Building. The voice was human, definitely not infected, and was providing real-time updates on infected activities across the city. According to this source, the infected had established command centers in major buildings throughout Manhattan and were coordinating operations that extended far beyond New York City. The broadcaster also mentioned something that explained the rapid evolution of infected capabilities. They were incorporating useful humans into their command structure without fully converting them. Military officers, engineers, medical personnel, anyone with specialized knowledge that could improve their operational effectiveness. These partial conversions retained their human intelligence and skills, while losing their emotional attachments and moral restraints. They were still technically human, but they were working for the infected with complete dedication and no regard for human welfare. The infection wasn't just recruiting human bodies, it was recruiting human expertise. By 11 o'clock, infected patrols were systematically searching every building in our area. We could hear them moving through apartment buildings floor by floor, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Their search patterns showed the kind of thoroughness that only comes from professional training and unlimited time. David's infection detection ability was telling him that they were getting closer, and that there were a lot more of them than we could see from our current position. The infected weren't just searching our immediate area, they were conducting a borough-wide sweep designed to locate and eliminate every remaining human survivor. Mrs. Rodriguez made the decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of trying to hide from the search, we would join it. She'd found a maintenance uniform in the park's utility building, and the plan was for me to dress as a city worker, while she and the children posed as my family seeking help from authorities. The plan was insane, but it might work because the infected were looking for hidden survivors, not people walking openly through the search area. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, especially when your enemies are expecting you to behave like prey instead of predators. At midnight on October 17th, 48 hours after the first infected had been spotted crossing from Brooklyn into Manhattan, we walked directly through an infected checkpoint disguised as refugees, seeking assistance from what we claimed were military authorities in the area. The infected at the checkpoint examined us with those horrible white eyes, checking our faces against some internal criteria I couldn't understand. But they let us pass, possibly because we didn't fit their search parameters for hidden survivors, or possibly because the partial conversions in their command structure had told them that open cooperation was more valuable than immediate elimination. Either way, we were through the perimeter and moving toward what remained of human-controlled territory. But as we walked through the darkened streets of Manhattan, surrounded by infected who were letting us pass, I realized that the situation had moved far beyond anything the military or federal government could handle. The infected weren't just winning, they were demonstrating organizational capabilities that exceeded human military efficiency. They were learning faster than we could adapt, recruiting our own people, and coordinating operations on a scale that suggested intelligence resources that shouldn't have been possible. And somewhere in those infected ranks, wearing a familiar uniform and carrying memories of 12 years of partnership, the thing that had been Martinez was probably reporting our location and direction of travel to whatever Central Intelligence was coordinating this invasion. We were heading toward uncertain safety in territory that might no longer exist, pursued by an enemy that was becoming more dangerous with every hour that passed. But we were still alive, still human, and still capable of making choices that mattered. That would have to be enough for now because the real test was just beginning. The dawn of October 18th revealed a Manhattan that no longer belonged to humanity. From our position near the East River, Mrs. Rodriguez and I could see infected moving through the streets in formations that defied everything we thought we knew about these creatures. They weren't shambling or wandering anymore. They were marching, in perfect synchronization, carrying tools and weapons, following routes that had been planned with military precision. But what terrified me most wasn't their organization. It was their innovation. During the night, they'd constructed barriers and fortifications using materials salvaged from the city around them. Shopping carts welded together with construction equipment. Cars arranged in defensive patterns that would make a combat engineer proud. Street signs repositioned to create a communication network that extended as far as we could see. These modifications weren't random. They followed engineering principles that required advanced planning and technical knowledge. The infected weren't just retaining human skills anymore, they were improving on them, combining individual expertise into collective capabilities that exceeded anything a human team could accomplish in the same time frame. David had spent the night watching them work, using his ability to detect their presence to track their movements without being spotted. He reported that they were following blueprints, actual technical drawings that someone or something was providing to coordinate their construction efforts. The level of organization suggested a central intelligence with access to urban planning resources and engineering expertise. Around 6 a.m, we witnessed something that changed my understanding of what we were fighting. A group of infected encountered a technical problem while trying to modify a subway entrance. They needed to cut through reinforced concrete, but their improvised tools weren't adequate for the job. Instead of abandoning the project or finding alternative approaches, they sent runners to locate specialized equipment. Within 30 minutes, they'd retrieved a concrete saw from a construction site 12 blocks away, not by accident or random searching, but because someone in their command structure knew exactly where that equipment was located and how to retrieve it efficiently. They had access to a comprehensive database of urban resources and the organizational capability to exploit it effectively. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me how that was possible. The infected had been human beings less than 72 hours ago. How could they develop logistical capabilities that rivaled major corporations or government agencies? I was starting to form a theory, but it was so disturbing that I didn't want to voice it until I had more evidence. Around 7:30, we got our evidence. Sarah, the college student who'd been with us since the evacuation from Brooklyn, rejoined our group after spending 2 days hiding in a medical facility on Roosevelt Island. What she'd observed there confirmed my worst fears about the true nature of the infection. Sarah had a pre-med background and she'd been able to observe infected behavior from a scientific perspective. According to her observations, the infection wasn't just reanimating dead tissue or creating mindless zombies. It was performing selective neurological modifications that enhanced certain cognitive functions while eliminating others. The infected retained their technical knowledge, problem-solving abilities, and capacity for learning, but they'd lost their emotional responses, moral constraints, and individual identity. What remained was pure intellectual capability, directed toward collective goals without any concern for human welfare or individual survival. Sarah also reported something that explained their rapid organizational development. The infected were sharing information directly through some form of biological networking. Individual experiences, technical knowledge, and tactical innovations were being distributed throughout the entire infected population in real time. Every infected individual had access to the combined knowledge and experience of every other infected individual. A infected who'd been a doctor could share medical expertise with the infected who'd been an engineer, creating hybrid capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual parts. By 8 o'clock, we were seeing the results of this collective intelligence in action. Infected teams were solving complex technical problems with efficiency that would have required weeks of planning and coordination for human organizations. They were adapting to obstacles faster than we could create them, learning from failures instantly, and implementing improvements across their entire operational area simultaneously. The federal evacuation zone in Queens had gone silent around midnight, but we'd been hoping it was just a communication failure. When Sarah described what she'd seen from Roosevelt Island, those hopes evaporated. The evacuation zone had been systematically dismantled by infected forces using captured military equipment and tactics learned from observing federal operations. But they hadn't just destroyed the evacuation zone. They'd studied it, analyzed its defensive positions, communication systems, and logistical support structures. Then they'd incorporated those lessons into their own organizational development, creating a hybrid command structure that combined military efficiency with biological networking. Around 9:30, we encountered our first infected reconnaissance team. 3 individuals moving through Central Park with equipment that appeared to be a combination of military communications gear and biological sensors. They were mapping human presence throughout the area with technology that could detect survivors from distances that made conventional hiding impossible. David's infection detection ability saved us from discovery, but just barely. The reconnaissance team passed within 50 feet of our position, and their equipment was definitely registering something in our area. They spent almost 20 minutes conducting a detailed search before moving on to the next sector. What disturbed me most was their search methodology. They weren't just looking for humans randomly. They were following a systematic pattern that suggested they were working from intelligence about specific individuals they wanted to locate. These weren't sweep operations designed to eliminate any survivors they encountered. These were targeted searches for particular people. Mrs. Rodriguez asked if they might be looking for us specifically. It was possible. The infected command structure had access to Martinez's memories about our group, our capabilities, and our likely behavior patterns. We might have become priority targets because of my police background and our success at evading capture so far. Around 10 o'clock, we intercepted radio communications that confirmed our worst fears. The infected weren't just operating in New York anymore. Similar outbreaks were being reported in major cities across the United States and around the world. But the international reports weren't describing chaotic zombie attacks. They were describing coordinated military operations with sophisticated command structures and advanced tactical capabilities. The infection had gone global, and it was learning from every engagement. Tactical innovations developed in New York were being implemented simultaneously in Los Angeles, London, and Tokyo. The collective intelligence wasn't limited to local infected populations. It was sharing information across continents in real time. An emergency broadcast from what remained of the federal government confirmed that conventional military responses had failed in every major metropolitan area. Nuclear options were being seriously considered, but targeting decisions were complicated by the speed with which infected populations could relocate and adapt to new threats. By 11:30, we were forced to abandon Central Park because infected patrols were becoming too frequent and too thorough to avoid. The reconnaissance teams were definitely tracking us, updating their search patterns based on our movements, and closing in with mathematical precision. Our escape route led through the subway tunnels toward the Upper West Side, but what we found underground was worse than anything we'd encountered on the surface. The infected had transformed the entire subway system into a fortified command complex with communication centers, manufacturing facilities, and what could only be described as research laboratories. Human subjects were being held in modified subway cars, undergoing procedures that appeared to be testing different infection protocols and conversion techniques. Some subjects were in various stages of partial conversion, retaining consciousness but displaying altered behavior patterns. Others were being subjected to what looked like enhanced interrogation techniques designed to extract specific information. Sarah recognized some of the medical equipment from her observations on Roosevelt Island. The infected were conducting systematic research into human biology, psychology, and social organization. They were studying us like laboratory specimens, learning how to exploit our weaknesses and overcome our resistance more effectively. The most disturbing discovery was a subway car that had been converted into what appeared to be a strategic planning center. Maps of major cities around the world covered every surface, marked with symbols that indicated operational status, resource availability, and tactical priorities. The scale of planning suggested coordination on a level that rivaled major military organizations. But the maps also showed something that gave me hope. Areas marked as cleared weren't completely empty of human activity. There were symbols indicating hidden survivor populations, resistance groups, and uncontrolled territories where human presence continued despite infected operations. The infection was winning, but it hadn't achieved total victory. There were still places where humans were fighting back successfully. Still communities that had found ways to resist the collective intelligence and maintain their independence. Around noon, we encountered something that changed everything I thought I understood about the infection. A subway car containing what appeared to be a meeting between infected leaders and human collaborators, not partially converted humans, but fully conscious people who were voluntarily working with the infected command structure. These collaborators weren't coerced or brainwashed. They were making rational decisions to betray their own species in exchange for privileged positions within the infected hierarchy. Some were government officials who'd survived the initial outbreak. Others were military officers who'd switched sides when they realized human resistance was futile. The collaboration wasn't limited to providing information or resources. These humans were actively participating in strategic planning sessions, contributing expertise that the infected needed to optimize their operations. They were helping design more effective conversion protocols, identifying key targets for elimination, and developing propaganda strategies to encourage further defection. Sarah was horrified by what we were witnessing, but I was starting to understand the tactical brilliance of the infected approach. Instead of trying to eliminate all human opposition, they were offering attractive alternatives to resistance. Cooperation meant survival, privileged status, and the opportunity to retain individual identity within the collective structure. For people who'd lost everything during the outbreak, who'd watched their families and communities destroyed, who faced certain death if they continued fighting, collaboration might seem like a reasonable choice. The infected were exploiting human survival instincts and social psychology with the same precision they applied to military tactics. By 1 o'clock, we'd reached the Hudson River waterfront and could see across to New Jersey. The view was devastating. Infected forces had established bridgeheads on the western shore and were systematically expanding their operational area. Smoke columns marked the locations of human settlements that were being eliminated or converted. But we could also see signs of organized human resistance, military vehicles moving in formation, aircraft conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance, missions and defensive positions that suggested coordinated planning. The infection hadn't achieved total dominance yet, and human forces were adapting their tactics to counter the collective intelligence. Around 2:30, we encountered a group of human survivors who'd been hiding in the subway tunnels for the past 24 hours. Their leader, a woman named Janet who'd been an emergency room physician before the outbreak, had information that explained why some humans were successfully resisting infection while others were being converted or eliminated. According to Janet's observations, the infected were applying different strategies based on individual assessment of human capabilities and potential value. People with useful technical skills or strategic knowledge were being targeted for conversion or collaboration. Those without specialized capabilities were simply eliminated as quickly and efficiently as possible. But there was a third category that was being handled differently. Humans who demonstrated exceptional resistance to infection, either through biological immunity or psychological resilience, were being studied extensively before elimination. The infected were trying to understand and overcome human resistance mechanisms. Janet also confirmed something we'd suspected, but hadn't been able to verify. The infected command structure included humans who'd been converted, but retained most of their original personalities and capabilities. These converted humans served as interface specialists, helping the collective intelligence understand and manipulate human psychology more effectively. By 3 o'clock, infected patrols had discovered our location and were converging on our position from multiple directions. The reconnaissance teams had been tracking us successfully, and the net was finally closing. We had maybe 15 minutes before they surrounded the building we were hiding in. But instead of random flight, we decided to implement something I'd learned during 12 years of police work. Sometimes the best way to avoid capture is to go where your pursuers least expect you to go. Instead of running away from the infected forces, we were going to move toward their command center. The plan was based on psychological profiling of collective intelligence behavior. The infected were supremely confident in their capabilities and convinced of their inevitable victory. That confidence might create blind spots in their security, especially in areas they considered completely secure. Mrs. Rodriguez thought the plan was insane, but she also understood that conventional escape attempts had a near-zero probability of success. The infected had superior numbers, better coordination, and complete knowledge of the urban environment. Our only advantage was the capacity for unpredictable decision-making that the collective intelligence might not anticipate. Around 4 o'clock, we infiltrated the infected command center in Times Square, using maintenance tunnels and service corridors. The level of activity was staggering. Hundreds of infected working in coordinated teams, processing information, coordinating operations, and managing resources with efficiency that exceeded anything I'd seen in human organizations. But the most shocking discovery was the extent of their intelligence-gathering capabilities. They had detailed files on thousands of human survivors, including photographs, biographical information, skill assessments, and tactical recommendations. The files weren't just military intelligence. They were comprehensive psychological profiles designed to predict and manipulate human behavior. Sarah found her own file in the database, along with detailed analysis of her medical knowledge and potential value as a converted specialist. The infected weren't just hunting us randomly. They'd been tracking us individually since the outbreak began, analyzing our capabilities and developing personalized strategies for capture or elimination. My file was particularly extensive, including information about my police training, tactical capabilities, and psychological profile based on observations of my behavior during the crisis. The infected command structure considered me a high-priority target because of my potential to organize effective human resistance. But the files also revealed something that gave me hope. The infected intelligence was impressive, but it wasn't perfect. Their psychological profiles were based on behavioral observation rather than true understanding of human motivation. They could predict what humans would do, but they didn't always understand why humans made certain choices. By 5 o'clock, we'd gathered enough intelligence to understand the scope of what we were fighting. The infected weren't just trying to eliminate human civilization. They were trying to replace it with something more efficient, more organized, and completely under their control. The ultimate goal wasn't extinction. It was transformation. They wanted to convert human society into a hybrid system that combined biological networking with technological infrastructure. Humans would survive, but only as components of a larger organism that valued collective efficiency over individual freedom. Around 6:30, we discovered the infected had developed a new conversion protocol that allowed them to create partial conversions with enhanced control mechanisms. These modified humans retained their technical capabilities and specialized knowledge while becoming completely loyal to the infected command structure. The new protocol was being tested on captured government officials, military officers, and technical specialists. The infected were building an administrative class of converted humans who could manage the transition from human to hybrid society with minimal disruption to essential services and infrastructure. But the conversion process wasn't irreversible. Sarah found evidence that some partial conversions had been reversed through procedures that the infected were studying intensively. They were trying to understand the biological and psychological mechanisms that allowed humans to resist or recover from infection. This research suggested that the infected were concerned about long-term sustainability of their control mechanisms. They needed to understand human resistance in order to prevent future rebellions or the development of effective countermeasures by surviving human populations. By 7 o'clock, we'd located what appeared to be the Central Intelligence coordinating infected operations across the entire metropolitan area. It wasn't a single individual or computer system. It was a biological network consisting of hundreds of converted humans connected through some form of direct neural interface. The network combined the processing power of human brains with the coordination capabilities of biological networking. Individual nodes could think independently, but they were also connected to a collective consciousness that could direct their activities and share information instantaneously. The sight of hundreds of humans sitting motionless with their eyes closed, connected by organic cables that pulsed with electrical activity, was more terrifying than anything we'd encountered during the outbreak. This wasn't death or zombification. This was the complete subjugation of human consciousness to serve an alien intelligence. But we also discovered something that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. The biological network had a critical vulnerability. If the central nodes were disrupted simultaneously, the entire network would experience cascade failure that could take hours to repair. Sarah identified the primary control nodes based on the complexity of their neural connections and the intensity of electrical activity. Destroying these nodes wouldn't eliminate the infected threat, but it would disrupt their coordination long enough for surviving human forces to mount effective counterattacks. Around 8:30, we realized that we weren't just observers anymore. We were potential saboteurs with the knowledge and opportunity to strike a significant blow against the infected command structure. The question was whether we were willing to sacrifice our own lives to give other humans a chance to fight back. Mrs. Rodriguez made the decision for all of us. She said the children deserved a chance to grow up in a world where humans were still free to make their own choices. If disrupting the network gave other survivors even a small advantage, then we had an obligation to act regardless of the personal cost. David volunteered to help, despite being only 15 years old. He said his infection detection ability might be useful in avoiding security measures, and that he wanted to do something that mattered before it was too late. The other children understood what we were planning, and they understood that they might not survive the attempt, but they also understood that running and hiding hadn't kept them safe so far, and that the infected were getting stronger while human resistance was getting weaker. By 9 o'clock, we developed a plan to simultaneously disrupt the 3 primary control nodes using improvised explosives created from maintenance chemicals and electrical components. The timing would have to be perfect, and we'd have to coordinate the attacks without electronic communication that the infected could intercept. The plan required splitting up, which meant that some of us might not survive even if the operation succeeded. Mrs. Rodriguez would take Tommy and the twins to safety while Sarah, David, and I handled the sabotage mission. As we prepared to implement the plan, I realized that we'd moved far beyond simple survival. We were fighting back against an enemy that had seemed invincible, using the same intelligence and adaptability that made humans dangerous opponents even when we were outgunned and outnumbered. The infected had superior organization, better coordination, and overwhelming tactical advantages. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the human capacity for sacrifice in service of principles that transcended individual survival. We were about to teach them that lesson in a way they wouldn't forget. At 10 o'clock on October 18th, 60 hours after the first infected emerged from Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, we began our assault on the biological network that controlled the infected forces across Manhattan. Sarah had identified the precise locations of the 3 primary control nodes, and we'd synchronized our watches to coordinate simultaneous attacks at 10:15 exactly. The plan was simple but dangerous. David and I would take the northern node located in what had been the New York Stock Exchange building. Sarah would handle the central node in the Times Square subway complex. The southern node, positioned in the World Trade Center transit hub, would be targeted using a delayed detonation device we'd constructed from maintenance chemicals and timing mechanisms salvaged from the subway system. Mrs. Rodriguez had taken Tommy, Lisa, and Maria to a predetermined evacuation point near the Hudson River, where they would wait exactly 30 minutes after the explosions before attempting to cross into New Jersey. If we didn't join them by 11 o'clock, they were to assume we hadn't survived and continue without us. The infected security around each control node was minimal, which initially seemed like good news. But as David and I approached the Stock Exchange building, I realized the light security wasn't an oversight. The infected command structure was so confident in their control that they didn't believe effective human resistance was possible. That overconfidence was about to cost them dearly. David's infection detection ability guided us through the building's lower levels, where we could hear the electrical humming of the biological network operating somewhere above us. The sound was unlike anything I'd encountered during my police career. Not mechanical, but organic and rhythmic, like a massive heartbeat pulsing through the building's infrastructure. At 10:12, we reached the sublevel where the northern control node was located. What we found there was both fascinating and horrifying. Dozens of humans connected to a central processing unit through organic cables that pulsed with bioluminescent activity. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but their brain activity was being harvested to serve the collective intelligence. Some of the connected humans I recognized from news broadcasts and government announcements. Federal officials who'd been reported missing during the early hours of the outbreak, military commanders who'd supposedly died fighting the infected, scientists and engineers whose expertise was being used to optimize infected operations. They weren't dead. They were being used as biological computers, their consciousness subsumed into a larger intelligence that valued their knowledge while discarding their individuality. In some ways, this fate seemed worse than simple death or conversion. At 10:14, 30 seconds before our scheduled detonation time, I placed the improvised explosive device next to the central processing unit. David was monitoring the corridors for infected patrols, but the building remained eerily quiet. The infected were so focused on their network operations that they'd neglected basic security protocols. The explosion at 10:15 was smaller than I'd expected, but the effect on the biological network was immediate and dramatic. The organic cables connecting the human nodes began convulsing. Electrical activity spiked and then disappeared, and the connected humans started waking up, for the first time in days. But they weren't waking up normally. They were screaming. The sudden disconnection from the collective intelligence was traumatic, like having part of their consciousness ripped away without warning. Some remained conscious but seemed unable to process individual thought. Others lapsed into catatonic states that suggested permanent neurological damage. David and I helped as many as we could reach the building's exit, but most of the disconnected humans were too disoriented to move. Without assistance, we had to leave them behind, hoping that other survivors would find them and provide the medical attention they desperately needed. At 10:16, we heard the explosion from Sarah's target in the Times Square complex, a muffled boom that echoed through the subway tunnels and was followed by a wave of infected activity as patrol units responded to the attack. The simultaneous disruption of two control nodes was already having visible effects on infected coordination. The third explosion, from the automated device at the World Trade Center site, came exactly on schedule at 10:17. 3 primary control nodes eliminated within 2 minutes, creating what Sarah had predicted would be a cascade failure throughout the infected command structure. The results exceeded our expectations. Infected patrols that had been moving in. Perfect coordination suddenly became disorganized and confused. Communication between infected units broke down completely. The collective intelligence that had made them so dangerous was fragmenting into thousands of individual organisms that could no longer share information effectively. But the disruption wasn't permanent. David and I could already see infected technical specialists working to establish backup communication systems using salvaged electronics and improvised networking equipment. The collective intelligence was adapting to the damage, finding alternative ways to coordinate their forces. At 10:30, we reached the Hudson River evacuation point where Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting with the children. Sarah joined us 5 minutes later, reporting that her attack had been successful, but that infected forces were already implementing countermeasures. We had maybe 20 minutes before their command structure stabilized and normal operations resumed. The crossing into New Jersey was the most dangerous part of our escape plan. The Hudson River was only a few hundred yards wide at this point, but infected patrols were covering both shores, and the infected command structure retained enough coordination to prevent organized evacuation attempts. Our solution was to use the chaos we'd created to our advantage. With their communication systems disrupted, infected units were operating independently and making tactical decisions without central coordination. Individual patrols were confused about their objectives and uncertain about their authority to engage targets. Mrs. Rodriguez had located a small boat that was seaworthy enough for the crossing, hidden in a marina that appeared to be abandoned. The boat had enough fuel for the journey, but no navigation equipment and no way to call for help if something went wrong during the crossing. At 10:45, we began our escape from Manhattan. The Hudson River was rough, with currents that made navigation difficult and visibility that was limited by smoke from fires burning throughout the city. But for the first time in 3 days, we were moving away from infected territory instead of deeper into it. Behind us, Manhattan was experiencing something that might have been chaos or might have been reorganization. Infected forces were definitely adapting to the loss of their primary control nodes, but their response was taking time and resources that might have been used to pursue escaping survivors. David reported that his infection detection ability was registering significantly less infected presence as we moved away from the Manhattan shoreline. The disruption of the biological network had either eliminated some infected entirely or reduced their coordination to levels that made them much less threatening. By 11 o'clock, we'd reached the New Jersey shore and could see the Manhattan skyline from a perspective that put our accomplishments in context. We'd survived 72 hours of the most dangerous crisis in human history. We'd rescued children, gathered intelligence about infected capabilities, and struck a significant blow against their command structure. But we'd also witnessed the collapse of human civilization in the world's most important city. We'd seen our own species betrayed by collaborators who'd chosen survival over resistance. We'd learned that the infected weren't just trying to eliminate humanity, but to transform it into something that served their purposes. The radio communications we intercepted from the New Jersey shore painted a mixed picture of global conditions. Some cities were reporting successful resistance operations and the establishment of secure zones for human survivors. Others had gone completely silent, suggesting either total infected victory or the implementation of nuclear protocols. Federal authorities were still operational, but their jurisdiction was limited to areas where military forces could maintain control against infected assault. The infection had spread too quickly and adapted too effectively for conventional government responses to contain or eliminate it. Sarah's medical analysis suggested that the infection was stabilizing into a new equilibrium rather than continuing to spread exponentially. The infected had achieved their primary objectives in most major metropolitan areas and were now focused on consolidating control rather than expanding their territory. This stabilization created opportunities for human survivors who could adapt to the new reality. The infected weren't trying to eliminate every human on Earth. They were trying to create a hybrid civilization that combined human capabilities with their own organizational advantages. By noon on October 18th, we'd made contact with a human resistance group operating out of a fortified position in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. Their leader, Colonel Martinez, was a career military officer who'd been organizing survivors and coordinating counterattacks against infected positions. Colonel Martinez confirmed that our sabotage operation had been successful beyond our immediate tactical objectives. The disruption of the Manhattan Command Network had created coordination failures that affected infected operations across the entire East Coast. Human resistance groups had used the opportunity to launch their own attacks against infected positions. But he also warned us that the infected were learning from every engagement and adapting their tactics faster than human forces could respond. The biological networking that gave them their coordination advantages also allowed them to share tactical innovations instantly across their entire operational area. The resistance group had intelligence suggesting that the infected were developing new control protocols that would make their command structure less vulnerable to the kind of sabotage we'd implemented. Future attacks would require different approaches and more sophisticated planning. Around 1 o'clock, we received a radio transmission that changed everything we thought we understood about the global situation. A broadcast from someone claiming to represent the infected command structure, speaking in perfect English with emotional inflection that sounded completely human. The speaker identified himself as Dr. Richard Chen, formerly of the Centers for Disease Control, now serving as a liaison between infected forces and remaining human populations. He wasn't making threats or demands. He was making an offer. According to Dr. Chen, the infected were prepared to establish autonomous zones where humans could maintain their own governments and social structures in exchange for formal recognition of infected sovereignty over metropolitan areas. The proposal included provisions for trade, communication, and mutual assistance in addressing global challenges. The broadcast wasn't propaganda or psychological warfare. It was diplomacy. The infected had evolved beyond simple predation or elimination. They were offering coexistence based on territorial division and mutual recognition of legitimate interests. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me what I thought about the proposal. It sounded reasonable, even generous, considering that the infected held overwhelming tactical advantages and could probably eliminate remaining human populations if they chose to do so. But I was suspicious of any offer that seemed too good to be true. The infected had demonstrated remarkable intelligence and strategic thinking. They wouldn't be making generous offers unless those offers served their long-term objectives better than continued warfare. Around 2:30, Colonel Martinez received confirmation that similar diplomatic overtures were being made to human resistance groups around the world. The infected weren't just trying to end hostilities in North America. They were implementing a global strategy designed to transition from warfare to political management. The speed and coordination of the diplomatic initiative suggested that the infected had been planning this transition from the beginning of the outbreak. The military phase had been designed to demonstrate their capabilities and eliminate organized resistance. The diplomatic phase was designed to achieve their objectives without the costs and uncertainties of continued warfare. Sarah's analysis of the proposal identified several concerning elements. The autonomous zones would be completely surrounded by infected territory, making human populations dependent on infected cooperation for trade and communication. The infected would control all major infrastructure and technological resources. Most importantly, the proposal included provisions for infected access to human educational and research facilities. They wanted to study human culture, technology, and social organization with the cooperation of human specialists rather than through forced extraction from captured subjects. By 3 o'clock, we were receiving reports that some human resistance groups were seriously considering the infected proposal. The prospect of peace, security, and guaranteed survival was attractive to people who'd been fighting for their lives for 3 days straight. But acceptance of the proposal would mean acknowledging infected sovereignty over most of the planet and accepting permanent minority status for human civilization. It would mean giving up any hope of reversing the infection or restoring human independence. Colonel Martinez called for a vote among the resistance group leadership. The question wasn't whether the infected proposal was acceptable, but whether human survival justified collaboration with an occupying force that had killed millions of people and destroyed human civilization. The vote was close, but the majority decision was to reject the infected proposal and continue resistance operations. The group believed that accepting the offer would only delay human extinction while providing the infected with time to perfect their control mechanisms. Around 4:30, we intercepted communications indicating that other resistance groups had reached different conclusions. Some were accepting the infected proposal and beginning negotiations for the establishment of autonomous zones. Others were rejecting it and preparing for renewed warfare. The human response to the infected diplomatic initiative was fragmenting along political and strategic lines. There would be no unified human position, no coordinated resistance strategy, no shared approach to the new reality. This fragmentation served infected interests perfectly. Divided human populations would be easier to manage than unified resistance movements. The infected could deal with each group separately, using different incentives and pressures to achieve compliance. By 5 o'clock, it was becoming clear that the infected had achieved their primary strategic objective. Human civilization, as we'd known it, was finished. What remained was a collection of isolated communities that would survive only as long as their continued existence served infected purposes. The choice facing individual humans wasn't between freedom and slavery. It was between different forms of accommodation, with a new reality that we couldn't change through resistance alone. Mrs. Rodriguez made the decision that I had been avoiding. She announced that she was taking the children to one of the autonomous zones being established under infected supervision. The children deserved safety, education, and the opportunity to build lives in whatever world emerged from this crisis. I understood her choice, but I couldn't make the same decision. My experience as a police officer had taught me that accommodation with criminal organizations only encouraged further criminal behavior. The infected might honor their agreements in the short term, but their long-term objectives were incompatible with human freedom. Sarah decided to continue working with the resistance group, using her medical knowledge to help treat infected victims and develop countermeasures against biological networking. David chose to stay with me, saying that his infection detection ability might be useful for resistance operations. At 6 o'clock on October 18th, 75 hours after responding to a routine call at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, I said goodbye to Mrs. Rodriguez and the children who'd survived 3 days of hell because of her courage and dedication. Watching them walk toward the infected checkpoint that would process them for admission to an autonomous zone was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But I also understood that their choice might be the wisest option for people who just wanted to survive and rebuild their lives. The radio transmission we received at 7 o'clock changed everything once again. Someone broadcasting from Manhattan using Martinez's voice and badge number, speaking directly to me by name, and referencing specific details from our partnership that only the real Martinez would know. But the message wasn't a trap or an attempt at manipulation. Martinez was warning me about something the infected command structure was planning, something that would make all the diplomatic initiatives and autonomous zone proposals irrelevant. According to Martinez, the infected were using the ceasefire negotiations to buy time for the implementation of a final solution to the human resistance problem. They were developing enhanced infection protocols that would allow them to convert entire populations simultaneously without the individual resistance that had characterized the initial outbreak. The autonomous zones weren't refuges for human survivors. They were processing centers where infected specialists could study human resistance mechanisms and develop countermeasures that would make future conversion efforts 100% effective. Martinez's warning came with specific intelligence about the location and timing of the enhanced infection deployment. The infected were planning to implement it within 48 hours, starting with the autonomous zones where human populations were concentrated and defenseless. At 8 o'clock, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life, however long that might be. Instead of joining Mrs. Rodriguez and the children in what might be temporary safety, I was going back to Manhattan to warn them about what was coming. David volunteered to come with me, and Sarah insisted that her medical knowledge might be crucial for understanding and countering the enhanced infection protocols. Colonel Martinez provided us with radio equipment, weapons, and intelligence about infected security measures. The return journey to Manhattan was more dangerous than our original escape, but infected security was focused on preventing unauthorized entry to their territory rather than stopping people who wanted to return voluntarily. They probably assumed that anyone willing to re-enter infected territory was either collaborating or posed no significant threat. By 9:30, we were back in the subway tunnels beneath Manhattan, moving toward the processing center where Mrs. Rodriguez and the children were being prepared for integration into the autonomous zone system. What we found there was worse than anything we'd encountered during the initial outbreak. Thousands of humans in various stages of processing, undergoing medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and what could only be described as compatibility testing for enhanced infection protocols. The infected weren't just planning to convert these people, they were planning to use them as test subjects for procedures that would be applied to human populations worldwide. The autonomous zones were laboratories for perfecting the complete subjugation of human consciousness. At 10 o'clock, exactly 24 hours after our sabotage attack on the biological network, we began our second assault on infected infrastructure. This time, our objective wasn't disruption. It was prevention of a catastrophe that would end human resistance forever. The enhanced infection protocols were scheduled for implementation at midnight, which gave us 2 hours to locate and destroy the research facilities where they were being prepared. But this mission was different from our previous sabotage operation. This time, we weren't just fighting for our own survival or the survival of a small group of children. We were fighting for the continued existence of human consciousness as an independent force in the universe. The infected had demonstrated that they could match or exceed human capabilities in every area except one. They couldn't replicate the human capacity for making choices that transcended rational self-interest. They couldn't understand why anyone would risk certain death to protect abstract principles or help people they barely knew. That limitation was about to become their downfall, because Sarah, David, and I were prepared to sacrifice everything to prevent the enhanced infection protocols from being implemented. We understood that some things were more important than individual survival. The mission ahead would test everything we'd learned about infected capabilities, human resistance, and the price of freedom in a world that no longer belonged to us. But we were still human, still capable of making choices that mattered, and still willing to fight for a future where being human meant something more than biological compatibility with an alien intelligence. The next 24 hours would determine whether that future was possible, or whether humanity's time as an independent species was finally coming to an end.